Hi, welcome everyone to this DI panel. Thank you for joining us on a panel on aligning efforts to reimagine public safety and invest community planning. My name is Amanda Mandrigal. I am the chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee for APA Illinois. DEI works to promote diversity in the planning profession, as well as advancing more just and equitable planning practices. We hope this discussion builds upon the growing conversations on reallocating public funds towards community-based investments. Before we start, we just want to there's a few housekeeping items. There's closed captioning available for this webinar if needed. Everyone is muted during the webinar, but please feel free to add your questions for the panelists in the chat. They'll be answered after the panel discussion. Now I'll hand it over to my co-host, Elizabeth, to introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. I just want to introduce our speakers real quick, and then we'll hand it off to them for this great discussion. First is Farah Muranyi, the Director of the City of Austin Office of Police Oversight, and also a member of the City of Austin Reimagining Public Safety Task Force. Before becoming the police monitor, Farah served as the Associate Vice President of Student Affairs and Dean of Students at the Chicago State University. While at CSU, Farah also served as the Interim Dean of Student Affairs, the Director of Intergovernmental Affairs, and the Board Liaison to the Board of Trustees. Our next speaker is Paola Aguirre Serrano, who's the founder of BORDERLESS, a Chicago-based collaborative city design and research practice. Paola focuses on multidisciplinary exchange, city systems integration, and participatory civic processes focused on social equity by leveraging her experience working with public, civic, and private organizations in Mexico and the United States. Paola received a Master's of Architecture and Urban Design from the Harvard School of Design and has taught at Archworks, the Sam Fox School of Design at Washington University, and the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. She's also a senior fellow with the Chicago United for Equity. Last but not least is Joe Horeth, who has served as the director of the Institute for Policy and Civic Engagement at the University of Illinois at Chicago since 2010, and was part of the team that founded the Institute in 2008. He holds a bachelor's in economics from the University of California at Berkeley, a master's and PhD in urban planning from Rutgers University, and was recently named as a senior fellow with the National Civic League. Joe teaches courses as adjunct faculty in the departments of urban planning and policy, as well as public administration at UIC. And with that, I'll hand it off to Joe. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And I'll just repeat the welcome to everyone in the room, to this virtual room, to this great session. Thank you to Elizabeth, Amanda, and Paula, and anyone else who had a hand in organizing this really great panel. And also thank you to Elizabeth for those great introductions. As she mentioned, I'm Joe Horeth. I'm with the Institute for Policy and Civic Engagement at UIC in the College of Urban Planning. Just a little nod out there to our CUPA alumni in the area who may be on the session with us. I'll just add a little personal disclaimer that my serving as a moderator on this panel does not imply an endorsement or of any strategy or policy being discussed. I only have to say that because I am a member of the independent monitoring team for the Chicago Police Consent Decree, a role which I serve generally in support of the independent monitor, Maggie Hickey, and her assessment of CPD progress towards the provisions of that decree. So of course, I have to state that to really safeguard my independence, but it doesn't stop me from facilitating what looks to be a really great conversation and an important one on this topic that I'm the moderator for today. Our well-curated topic, aligning efforts to reimagine public safety and invest in community planning, is really the nexus in which planners and those who work in this space need to approach the topics of public safety and planning. And so the panelists are each going to share some relevant work that they're doing for about 10 minutes. Then I'll pose some follow-up questions to the panelists and we'll engage in a discussion And then we'll follow that up with opening it up for just questions from the audience for the final half hour. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Farah to start. And Farah, I'm wondering if you could share maybe for 10 minutes, an overview of your work in Austin, Texas.
Thank you, Joe, and good evening, everybody. Happy to be here. Again, my name is Farah Muskeden, and I serve actually quite a few roles with the city of Austin. I jokingly like to say my real 9-to-5 is being the director of the Office of Police Oversight. And so very similar, I'm from Chicago, so very similar to COPA. We are responsible for oversight of the whole department and the place where people come to file complaints or submit, thank yous for Austin police officers. And we have three main components of our office: the oversight, policy and research, and community engagement. And so we have been really fortunate in being able to build that department and really push police reform and better oversight practices in Austin. I'm also on the Reimagining Public Safety Executive Team. And so this is where we talk about and where decisions are made about what that actually means for the city. I've been recently named co-chair of the whole portfolio. So that's been really interesting because I direct, now I'm facilitating the evaluation of the recommendations that came from our City Community Reimagining Task Force. And that was created at the direction of our city manager. In Austin, we are a city manager council form of government, so very different than strong mayor in Chicago. And so it was primarily city executive leadership and about 15, 16 community members. And the task force primarily, mainly focused on those working with communities that are most negatively impacted by law enforcement and public safety. And so we really wanted to elevate those voices. And we started meeting in August and met regularly, and they presented their recommendations to our city council on April 20th. So right now I have a team of about 60 people that are reviewing those recommendations to see what the city can actually implement. And I feel like I'm speaking to a group who speaks similar language to me in that when we talk about public safety does not equate to law enforcement. And so I really want to be clear about that. When we talk about public safety, we're talking about after school programs, lights in neighborhoods, we're talking about shelter, food access. And so that is really a more of a broad characterization. And I'm just going to give you a general overview, particularly now because we are a year from the murder of George Floyd. There's a lot of news media out, particularly today, talking about what cities have done since his murder. And, Austin repeatedly gets discussed because of the reduction of $150 million from the city budget. So I want to talk about that generally speaking, but I do definitely want to encourage you to go to our website. We have a specific website designated for this information, and we are very transparent. So everything I'm telling you right now is on that website, and it is austintexas.gov, spelled out, austintexas.gov/public safety. That is our Reimagining Public Safety website, and all these numbers that I'm going to talk to you about right now is all on that. The work of the task force is on it. You can watch prior meetings if you'd like. You could read their task force recommendations. That report is there. We also did a very, very heartfelt presentation about the history of race and policing and its impact on communities of color pretty early on, and that timeline is on the website as well. And it was really interesting, particularly for Austin. I think it was maybe in the 1940s, the first Black officer, and he wasn't able to have a gun or arrest anybody white. So, learning that was very interesting in terms of the history of Austin as it relates to policing. But let's get to the meat of the conversation, which is about reimagining and reinvestment. So primarily, the public safety budget, and when I say public safety, I mean police, EMS, and fire, has been about 70% of the city of Austin's budget. And that is a huge number, right? And unfortunately, that's the case, I think, for most cities across the country, right? 40% of that 70% is just police. So when we're talking about a $1 billion entity, for FY20, the city of Austin's police department's budget was $434 million. For FY21, our current fiscal year, that was reduced to $292 million. It's a difference of about 150 million, but I really want to explain to you the difference and what that means. So City Council created 3 different buckets of dollars that were, I guess, reinvested or relocated from the police department budget. Those budgets include the decoupling budget, which is at about 76.6 million. And what that means is there were entities within the police department that council and city management felt like they didn't belong in the police department. They weren't necessarily related to traditional law enforcement. For example, did the Austin Police Department really need their own HR department? Did they need their own communications in terms of like media department? Did they need their own finance department, right? All of those have been decoupled. We call those administrative departments. They have been decoupled and they're now included as part of the central functions of the city of Austin. So for example, the former PD HR department is now included in the central corporate HR department. Same with the communications, media department, same with the finance department. So those were pretty easy steps to decouple, because what we see in police departments is kind of this massive entity, and with that massive department comes a lot of power, right? And that needed to be addressed. The second bucket is the Reimagine bucket. That bucket has $45 million in it. And that bucket includes items like the lake patrol. Do we need officers to patrol the lake? Mounted patrol. Do we need officers on horses? Do we need that unit? Park patrol. Do we need officers patrolling our parks? Traffic enforcement. And I feel pretty strongly about traffic enforcement because I think that's directly related to the work that I do in my 9-to-5 as it relates to racial profiling. I do think that there are inroads that we can make in terms of traffic enforcement. And so that's part of the Reimagine bucket. The budget bucket I think that you all are going to be most interested in is the reinvestment bucket. And that is $31.5 million. And I want to go into little more detail about what that actually means. What that means is that from that original $434 million budget that APD had in the prior fiscal year, $31.5 million of that was permanently taken and invested in other areas that I consider fall under, and not just me, council and city management fall under the area of public safety. And what we mean by public safety is areas that improve the quality of life of our residents, right? And so monies was invested into emergency, our EMS, our emergency management system, our public health department for COVID response, the creation of a family violence center, $8 million of that, and that was recently opened. Permanent supportive housing. It's been a while since I've been in Chicago, maybe about 5 years, so I don't know about the homeless situation, but in the homeless situation is pretty significant in Austin. And so there was investment of dollars to establish more permanent housing, supportive housing, substance abuse counseling, food access, workforce development, improvement in mental health response. That is a big deal in Austin. Where we're really moving away from officers responding to calls that were clearly identified as mental health related or someone in mental health crisis. So there really needed to be a monetary investment in those who have the actual skill set and expertise and training to deal with those types of calls when, you know, officers aren't really necessarily equipped for that. My office, our budget actually doubled an investment from that. There was increased investment in our equity office, and dollars were reinvested from the police department to create our new civil rights office. And then also dollars were invested for immigrant legal services and family violence programs. And that's just, you know, a quick list that I pulled together. But essentially, I see that $35 million as reinvestment into areas that help the community directly, that directly translate into better public safety in a broader sense. And so we are working through the decoupling. And as I mentioned before, that decoupling was 76.6 million. And let me tell you what has been decoupled in addition to the administrative offices that we talked about before is the forensic lab. So obviously when there's any sort of forensic evidence that's taken from a crime, that forensic lab was a part of the police department and controlled by the police department. And our community felt pretty strongly that it should be separate. I believe in Chicago, because I feel like I've toured it a couple of times. It is a separate entity in Chicago. And so that is now separate from the police department. We've also decoupled, meaning that we have separated from the police department, our 911 center. So now that it is its own separate entity that will facilitate 911 calls. And they have seen significant improvements in there. And now that, you know, when you call 911, they always ask you, do you need police, fire, or EMS? They now ask, do you need police, fire, and mental health services? And so we're really hoping to push that forward, particularly with the investment in the mental health response, so that it is an alternate response than police response. What I think is really interesting for this audience to know as well is, and this is what we're continuing to work on, particularly when we talk about the 45 million in the Reimagine Budget bucket, we have seen, obviously, and I think most police departments have seen some changes in terms of their response, particularly during the pandemic, right? In Austin, they adjusted their response. They didn't respond to calls right away. They assessed them to see, is this something that I can speak to somebody on the phone about or call them back? Is this something that we can send them a link for them to report on online? And so a lot of times patrol didn't necessarily need to respond. And the reason why I bring that up is that of that larger bucket that PD received, for example, that 292 million for FY21 budget, 56% of that, or 165 million, is for patrol. And that's a lot of money. So when we talk about reimagining, and we're talking about looking at different ways for police response and how they patrol, or police generally speaking, looking at those dollars and reallocating them is going to be really key. And so I think over time, we will see that number decrease because I think we are seeing, particularly as a result of the pandemic, different ways that, particularly when people are calling 911, for a police response, and also seeing ways that the response doesn't necessarily have to be from police, which means that those dollars can be reallocated for the appropriate response. And so that's really kind of the overview of what we're looking at. I will tell you from a from a professional perspective, I'm looking forward to the other items that are on the decoupling list. They include internal affairs. I don't really think that officers should investigate themselves. And so I'm looking forward to that conversation of that being decoupled and no longer under the police department. Don't know where it's going to go, but I'm looking forward to that being transferred out. Victim services. This is a conversation that's a little tough. Victim services is the department that's part of the police department that respond to victims of crime and really support them and provide resources to them. Most of them are in that conversation now, whether or not, you know, they work very closely with the police department, whether or not that should stay in there. There's conversations that it should be maybe a part of public health or our new Office of Violence Prevention that was funded through the reinvestment dollars. So we're in that conversation now. And the other one that's on the table is what we call our Special Investigations Unit. This is the criminal division in the police department that investigates crimes, potential crimes of officers. So they work hand in hand with our district attorney's office. So they would work, I'm sure CPD has a similar unit, and they work really closely with the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. So essentially, do we need Austin police officers investigating themselves for potential violation of criminal statutes? You know, so that is again on the potential chopping block for the decoupling. But this is, you know, this is complicated stuff. I'm not telling you anything that you don't know, but what I appreciate in Austin is that we are at least having these tough conversations. And what you guys will enjoy that you don't experience, that we experience here in Austin. I was a lobbyist for 10 years, and so I'm very familiar with Illinois politics and the Illinois legislature. And I have never experienced, like, local control was very significant there, and generally home rule was very much protected. And so the governor here in Texas is potentially going to be signing a bill momentarily that penalizes cities who have reallocated funds from police department. And I just can't imagine that's something that would be done in Illinois, maybe in an indirect way, but maybe not a direct way. And so here in Texas, we have a legislature that uses its authority through the legislature to punish cities like Austin who are trying to move the needle forward. That is something that I've never really experienced as a lobbyist in Illinois. And so it's interesting to see that dynamic because apparently here in Texas, local control doesn't mean much. So I will stop there. Been happy to, looking forward to hearing Paula, and happy to answer questions when we get there.
Thanks, Farah. That's a lot. Hopefully we get to dive into some of that in the discussion, some more of that in the discussion. So yes, Paula, why don't you go ahead with an overview of your current work?
Thank you, Joe. Farah, thank you so much for sharing all that. I'm just really excited that this work is being done, and hopefully it's a form of reference, right, for advancing some of the efforts locally. I know Chicago and Austin, very different cities, but lessons to learn, share across these different territories. That's what these conversations are so important and valuable. So I'm going to share my screen, and please let me know if you cannot see it. Real good. Can you see that? Okay, great. Excellent. So it was mentioned previously, but I'm part of, I'm a senior fellow for Chicago United for Equity. And CUE has been one of the organizations leading this project and putting forward this idea of what happens when we bring those that are the most impacted by policy decisions to the room at the table to be active participants in determining their future, including how our resources, our public resources, such as city budget, are allocated. So one of the important things about this project is that, it started last year in Chicago, and participatory, it's based on inspiring participatory budget. But participatory budget is not necessarily a new thing in Chicago. Many aldermen, many institutions such as Great Cities Institute, Cities Institute at USC also has been assembling teams and supporting this type of work. We were interested through this lens and assembling People's Budget Chicago in a way to prioritize engaged residents, but also amplify the voices of community that are the most impacted by racial inequity in the decision-making process in our city budget. So the first thing that we decided to do as a collective it was, how do we design a question that brings us not only from the place of harm reduction, but also brings us to a place of transformation? So how do we think of resources in a way that it brings us into a conversation where we are asking ourselves how or why do our communities need to be safe and thriving? How do all Chicagoans, how every child in a neighborhood in Chicago has opportunities to be safe and thrive? To understand the different components of the project, most of the projects at CUE work from a framework of acknowledging history and the communities that are most impacted. Secondly, shifting power. How do we bring residents to the table? How do we really think and shift the way that we think about decision-making process? And also, how do we create frameworks? How do we build accountability in a way that decisions are not unilateral? Decisions are only depending on our public officials, but more so public officials are listening to what residents want to do with how do I want to allocate public resources. So that was the general framework for thinking about this project. How do we move? How do we elevate voices how do we collectively decide how those resources should be invested in prioritized items? And how do we organize and how do we collectively think of ways in which our elected officials feel accountable to the communities that elected them? And the first thing to learn, and this was a journey, I'm a designer by training, and learning first what is the process of the budget, right? If you ask half of Chicagoans, or more, probably more than, they're not really familiar with this process. So first taking information that is very difficult or very, it's not as accessible to read, and thinking of how do we bring this information in a way that residents from every community can understand and follow. From all the way for like, what does it mean when budget requests by departments happen? What are the resources that need to be allocated in that moment, how those decisions are made, all the way to city council must approve a budget by the end of the year. And budget requires at least 26 votes to pass. If you follow the budget approval from last year, it was the closest budget that had a very different type of voting from previous years. And one of the other important things from this effort was educating our communities around the budget. When we talk about a budget, we not necessarily understand that a lot of our resources are not controlled by city council. So a big chunk of the money, a big part of the city budget is allocated through sister agencies, are not included in the city budget. So they have their own ways of governance. They have their own ways of decision-making process, and that is big amounts of money, such as Chicago Public Schools, Chicago Transit Authority, Chicago Housing Authority, Chicago Park District, also in city colleges. So we're actually just taking, when we work when we thought of understanding how the communities can speak to their public officials, their older people, is understanding first what are the resources that they vote on. And obviously, if you want to take a deep dive on the budget, no one necessarily has time to read the multiple documents that get posted in the City of Chicago's website, even less to read through 200 pages, right? So a lot of our effort, how do we bring this information in a way that we could have a conversation that is both informed, but also give us the opportunity to talk about different items, right? So we simplified, and this simplification of the budget came from understanding what are the elements that fall within that within the different city departments, right? So health, education, housing, infrastructure, community resources, and very deliberately naming the carceral system and how the police and the police accountability items are included in that category. The other thing that happened in this project as part of the framework was understanding what are not the usual suspects. If we know that the most impacted communities are not going to be the ones attending town halls, they're not going to be the ones prioritizing being part of those processes that are mostly targeted to folks in mostly white neighborhoods or northern neighborhoods in Chicago. So how do we prioritize communities to be part of this process and elevating their voices? One of the items and one of the research items that came to play here was selecting the Childhood Opportunity Index as a guiding resource. To understand the investment priorities of our most impacted communities, this became a very important tool for us to prioritize where do we want it to go first and elevate the voices of those communities. So you can see there, Inglewood, Bronzeville, Austin, Roseland, Algal Gardens, Inglewood, Whitterground Crossings were places that we prioritize, understanding that we wouldn't have enough time. Obviously, this is 2020, middle of COVID, civil unrest as well. So we wanted to be mindful also of communities' capacities and processes to understand how can we engage in a dialogue that was productive for both of them. So in many of the spaces, a lot of the conversation started with reflection, but also with participatory budgeting and ending on a tone of how do we do best in communicating our public officials these priorities that people want. So I'm going to play a short video that summarizes a little bit what was the intent of the messaging and the campaign, but also wanted to share there is a public website, peoplesbudgetchicago.com, and this will give you a little bit of the general narrative. The other important thing to mention is that this is a multidisciplinary team of folks working in this project, from folks that are working in government, research, storytelling, organizing, advocacy, and philanthropic organizations. So we really look at the project from policy, from shaping public policy to shaping narrative to community organizing.
This year, the City of Chicago's budget was $12.6 billion. For 2021, our city is planning to spend even more, $13.5 billion. That's a lot of money, but no matter how much we have, we're always told there's not enough for our communities. What if the problem isn't how much we have, but how our politicians are spending it? If we could choose where our dollars go, how would we invest in building safe and thriving communities?
Homeownership, housing.
Money to the house people to build more houses.
Community resources, the infrastructure of the schools that we already have here that aren't being used.
Lack of quality education, community resources, and health.
Definitely health. Dealing with health.
Health, education, housing, infrastructure, and community resources.
Something that I heard a lot from people was also mental health resources and health resources in general.
Free health clinics, places to go, especially for things like mental health resources.
Housing and mental health.
More money put into mental health.
Education.
Housing and education and mental health.
More police accountability and mental health.
For me, it's very important that torture survivors' voices are heard, as well as the disabled and those who suffer with mental health issues.
People. We have to put the time and the money into the actual person. Otherwise, the buildings won't matter when the people are too sick or mentally ill to appreciate them.
The People's Budget Chicago started with communities most impacted by historical disinvestment. Neighbors came together in Inglewood, Bronzeville, West Humboldt Park, Austin, Roseland, Uptown, Altgeld Gardens, Ryden Park, and Greater Grand Crossing to answer the question, what do our communities need to be safe and thriving? They debated, negotiated, and ultimately worked together to build a budget that invests in a better future for all of us.
The People's Budget Chicago says that for every $100 of our tax money, we should spend $22 in health, 21 in housing, 19 in education, 19 in community resources, 12 in infrastructure, and 7 in the carceral system that includes policing and police accountability. This might seem obvious to most of us, but right now, it's a huge shift from how our leaders spend our dollars. The People's Budget Chicago shows us that by reducing police spending, we have enough for our communities to invest in early childhood education, mental health, and healthcare, and affordable housing.
We need every person that believes in equitable and fair investment of city resources to reach out to their older people starting today. Call your older people, email them, mail them an old school handwritten letter, send them a tweet, and demand that they fight to create a city budget that reflects the needs and will of the people.
So there's some resources for that, and I won't go in depth. I just want to show you, which you also saw in the video, like how was some of these interactions, how the documentation of voices, and also the activation of residents and helping them to understand how to build, how to organize, number one, and then secondly, how to strengthen the communications with their older people. So I'm gonna stop there and turn this into the discussion conversation.
Thank you, Paula. And thank you, Farah, as well. You both gave us a lot to chew on and think about. I wondering, with regard to how we define and redefine public safety, and you both kind of talked about that as a theme within your work. Can you talk a little bit about, Farah, you told the interesting story of the police officer, the first Black police officer hired in 1940, and interesting constraints on his power at that time. But how are the origins of the current public safety system kind of still entrenched in the system that we're living with today? And how does your work, to what extent is your work really trying to address that or undo that? And I pose that to either of you.
So I think in Austin, it's interesting because, Austin is considered the blueberry of Texas. Texas was pretty conservative, but the blueberry can be a bit misleading. And what we often talk about, Austin is really facing its history of systemic racism and oppression in a very direct way. And what we often talk about is the 1928 plan that was passed by the Austin City Council that divided the city basically east and west. And so all people of color, Latinx, Black, were pretty much required to live in the east side of Austin. We have a major highway. So if I compare it to Chicago, if we look at the Dan Ryan, all the Black people were required to live west, so Bridgeport, and all the white people lived east, so closer, obviously, to the lake, right? And it's literally demographically and geographically divided that way. And so what you see is disinvestment, lack of resources, food deserts, over-policing on the east side of Austin. And so with this reimagining public safety, I don't know if I want to call it an initiative or movement or whatever the proper term is an opportunity to right the wrongs of the past and also really talk about equity in a real way as opposed to equality, right? And so, because we cannot get the two mixed up. And so when I gave you the list I love the video that Paola showed, because everything that the community members were talking about investing in are things that, the city of Austin has taken steps to invest that $31.5 million in it. So could it be more? 100%. But I think that, it's a step that many cities obviously have a difficult time taking. But I think that when you're looking at historical inequities and how much systemic racism has impacted Black communities and communities of color, that investment has to be intentional to repair the ongoing harm and really stop it and adjust it so that there is true equity.
Yeah, Paola.
I just, it's so super interesting because for me, I started learning about budget in Chicago at the same time that I was working on this project last year. So it was learning by doing in many ways. And that was really helpful for us to really be sympathetic with a lot of the residents that we were meeting. We think it's very important to recognize there's a lot of initiatives that have been locally working in this issue. It's just the belief behind people's budget, for instance, is how do you pull all those efforts together to strengthen the power that community can have in making demands to their public elected officials. So I think the idea of coalitions, the idea of alliances, the idea of all these efforts that can be, Chicago has a very strong history of organizing. So how do we leverage that capacity and the multiple organizations that are already working in this item and collectively think of ways in which this can be more impactful. The research pointed us to items that were very clear in terms of where do we want resources to be allocated. So you saw the top 3 elements: public health, and housing, and community resources are not a surprise to anyone, but then start to think, how similar to how Farah was saying, like, why are these items included in a powerful agency in the case of Chicago Police Department, right? Why does emergency need to be, why police officers need to be responsible for responding to mental health issues when there's obviously other capacities that are needed, there's other type of training, et cetera, et cetera. So when we identify those top priorities, and then how now they become policy strategies to start talking to our city departments, that bridge, I think for me is very interesting. How our government structures that are very rooted in a way of producing or decision-making process and producing results that are unilateral, how do we start creating bridges for those voices to be heard, right? The idea of this project being from the side of imagination, like, can we understand what the problem, and that's why it's really clearly starts with 12.6 billion. It's not little money. It's just the way that when it starts seeing the breakdown, we understand, okay, there's some interesting shifts that can happen in order to meet the needs of people in our most impacted communities.
Paula, I like how you just referred to reimagining, and Farah, it's obviously a key element in your work in Austin. I have kind of 2 questions that I want to ask at once. But the first, since we have an audience of a lot of planners, the first one I want to kind of touch on for planners is, if we're talking about reallocating funds, how might planners use their resources to support community-based initiatives around public safety? Are there ways planners could provide support without any new money, for example? Or, what in the elements of your work is there that might create an opportunities for planners to think alongside you about how you're reimagining the resources for public safety?
So I think I'm going to draw an analogy to my work with the Office of Police Oversight. And so we believe 100% in transparency, but we don't believe we are the end all, the be all of oversight. We believe that the oversight is also provided by the community at large, right? Because I feel very strongly that the police work for the community, and they should dictate how they're policed. And so I often say to my staff is that we have to provide receipts to communities so they can take forward to, city manager, their city council members to really push forward policy, right? And they did a lot of that in terms of, there was a lot of community organizing to push forward for this reinvestment in dollars. And so I would say as planners, it's that partnership with community to help inform them of the data needed, now I shouldn't say primarily, but to help convince the elected officials that this is what needs to go, like to show the connection that if you invest here, this is your most likely going to be your outcome. And so I think that's very difficult for most elected officials to see in a way. And I think this is the way the expertise of planners coupled with the access and the organizing community members have to join forces to really push that reinvestment forward. Because I just don't see one doing it without the other. I think it's really got to be that joint coalition between the subject matter experts in terms of the planning side of it, and then also the push that the community has in their power as community.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Like, for instance, one of the top items in one of the top priorities for people's budget and recommendations after this work was completed last year was community safety requires investing in community health. If we don't understand and if we don't keep pushing for that obvious relationship, community safety means, sorry, I'm going to repeat that. Community safety requires investing in community health. And there's a lot of work on that to be done. I would recommend you to also research and get familiar with campaigns that are looking into this, both from the advocacy perspective and research perspective around, there's one campaign called Treatment, Not Trauma. And the item that is proposing is, as opposed to the mental health corresponder model that would continue to create a criminal record for mental health crisis, this model ensures that trained social workers respond to crisis and no criminal records are created for those in crisis. The council order begins with $6 million and funding. So, you know, where with concrete numbers, I think the shift can be, or the resources can be identified. But it's just like that funding is just to jumpstart a citywide approach. Whereas to the corresponder model only offers support for 2 police prisons out of the 22 in the city. So a lot of the ideas behind, you know, how much is allocated, it's more about what do you prioritize first. So if the concept is understood that community safety means community health first and foremost, then how do you start supporting the initiatives and the dollars that need to be invested in those initiatives to support that policy?
Thank you, Paola and Farah. I'm wondering also about why do you think it's so difficult to change budgets, period, and to make budgets more equitable? Why do you think that work is? And you can take issue with the question too if you want. If you don't think it's difficult, you could say that. But it just feels like this is a serious, you know, there's some serious challenges to this kind of work.
I keep going first, but I think Paula should go first.
Oh, thank you. Well, I do have, you know, I feel like the relationship of residents with their elected officials speaks to a lot of that, right? You know, if elected officials or elder people could you know, invest in informing their constituents or residents on how the budget's spent, you know, they do it for themselves, right? They have to allocate resources, make tough decisions all the time. In the city of Chicago, there's several aldermen that do it, but it's because they believe in this type of transparency and this type of work, but it's not required, right? So when it's an option, you don't have to do it. So I feel like if there was a policy around transparency and participatory budgeting processes from the scale of the ward, we can be number one, speaking about collective investment and also thinking about, you know, the impact that certain investments in certain areas of the city have. Also, the fragmentation of our wards has made very difficult to coordinate investment, right? Our gerrymandering, our boundaries make no sense in the ward system. So there's a lot of embedded items in the system that make very difficult collective decision making around specifically around budget. So I think, you know, the question is, why do we have more equitable budgets? Well, because every system in place, number one, doesn't require transparency in the item. Two, every jurisdiction is just calling for fragmentation and not collective decision-making process. So I think the more that we create frameworks of accountability, what if there's a people's budget council? We prototype some of that where residents from Roseland were speaking to budget representatives from Roseland, we're speaking to budget representatives from Austin. And there was a conversation that was really interesting because they were talking about similar issues, completely different other people, right? So how do we empower residents? How do they learn from each other, exchange from each other, but also understand the different impacts of investment or lack of disinvestment in their different geographies. So I would say the idea of shifting power is not just a rhetoric. Like, how do you actually prototype that and build it and make it into a public policy item where other people need to consult and need to get consensus about the way that they allocate and spend resources with their community members in an organized way.
Go ahead, Farah. And Farah, I want to add another just specific element to your question. You were able to, Austin was able to effectively shift a large amount of resources to other activities, as you described. Was there fear about this from folks in Austin, from the community, from interest groups, and was that a significant barrier or challenge? So on your way to answering why it's difficult, maybe address that aspect.
So I think it's extremely difficult, and I think budgets are a position of power for elected officials, and it is a way they control us, right? And I'm just being maybe too honest about it. And so I think that is why it is extremely difficult. And it is a way that communities are controlled because it is a way they control the resources to those specific communities. And so that's why I think it's like lifting mountains to get governments at local, state, and federal level to really look at reinvestment and reallocating funds that are more efficient. And really looking at ways to be more efficient with those dollars. And the connection in terms of, because a lot of this is about thinking about budgets that will, in the long run, actually save governments money, but it's not really set up that way. It's not really about the short-term investment for the long-term gain, right? Because we only think about budgets in a fiscal year, right? And we're limited to that. We've got to spend this much money every fiscal year, and you don't want to leave any on the table. And that's where you kind of get that waste, right? That you see a lot. I've seen it at every level because I worked at the county, the city, the state, universities, and I see it repeatedly that it's not really set up to be efficient. But I've also seen repeatedly is that it is a point of control. To the second point of your question about, well, how was Austin able to do it? I have to tell you, the difference in form of government is a game changer. Because when I worked for the city, I mean, I don't remember, City of Chicago, I don't remember the community being involved at all in the budget process, at all whatsoever. It was really primarily controlled through the mayor's office. And, you know, I worked in the mayor's office. And so it was essentially what they wanted to propose, and the city council always voted for it. I worked under Richard M. Daley. In Austin, it is totally different. I honestly was surprised and taken back how much it is expected that we do community engagement. And I found it a little annoying, even though I'm a community person, right? And so we have budget sessions constantly. We have a budget dashboard. We have like a website where people could put input on where they think the funding should go, and, you know, advocating for that. But when it came to the policing part of it, the only people really that had issue with it were the law enforcement, the, you know, kind of the Blue Lives Matter group, because they equate safety only with law enforcement. So they think doubling the police department is going to make us safer. And there's no evidence for that, clearly, right? And so essentially it was really the pressure from the people. And when I tell you they put the pressure on, I mean, I sat through city council meetings where 500 people came, and we were in council till 1 o'clock in the morning listening to testimony from community about how they really needed to reinvest. And it is very similar to Chicago, but I feel like it's a little bit more drastic in Austin between the haves and the have-nots. And it's literally divided by, you know, the highway. And so it's something that City Council really couldn't ignore anymore, because the communities of color in Austin are hurting really, really bad. And the other communities are like living the dream, right? And so it is just something that, but I don't know, honestly, I don't know, but for the community pressure and the organizing and them being so involved in the budget process, not only historically, but also even more so with the push from police reform and wanting to change things, that really helped. It'll be interesting to watch what happens this fiscal year. That's really what I think is going to be key. And
yeah, I'm super excited about what you're mentioning, Farah, because, well, number one, I've been learning, you know, as any resident, how difficult is to find your way into engaging in these conversations, right? When there's no platform, when there's no process. I think for us was very important to look at other models. So looking what Los Angeles is doing, People's Budget of Los Angeles it's organized. Well, the lead organizer for the People's Budget in Los Angeles is the Black Lives Matter movement. So it's heavily, asking for defunding police in a much more strategic way as part of the campaign and messaging. We look at other cities, New York City, where the government, similar to Austin, is the one that is driving more of those conversations. So we looked at multiple kind of models and asked ourselves, what is the God, we didn't want to just bring a template, but asking ourselves, what is the version of People's Budget that Chicago deserves, specifically given all the layered political implications, right? As you mentioned, there's some comments in the chat flowing around. Yes, money and power are interrelated, right? So other people, our city council members, definitely, that's an item that it's difficult to democratize. So how do we, through these projects, if the city doesn't offer the platform, the resources and the investment in this type of community processes, then how do we think of ways of modeling how it could be? So oftentimes as a designer, if there's no table, you basically need to design the table. So for us, this is an effort to do that. How do you design a table that feels community-led in a way, thinking how this could be felt like a platform that elevates voices, not necessarily repeating like how can we not do things, but how can we imagine things can be done?
Yeah, so great. So amazing to hear about the work both of you are doing, and the contrast between Austin and Chicago. For those of us in Chicago, I think really helps with the imagining and the reimagining aspect of this conversation. So we have a ton of comments in the chat and questions in the chat, but also folks who may have questions who haven't asked them yet. So I'm going to turn it over to Amanda and Elizabeth to share questions from the audience that have either come up in the chat or any other way.
Great, thanks, Joe. So I think the first question that kind of ties into what we're still talking about, and we can keep it going, is just like how are planners kind of complicit in existing policing systems? So the example in the chat was relying on law enforcement to protect pedestrian and cyclists. And even I often think about the transit system. And I guess kind of a follow-up to that, like what are other ways, what other strategies that we can use to keep people safe on the street and in those like public environments?
I'm sorry, but I just think that you do not need a very well-paid, specifically trained officer to manage what you just said or to do traffic control. Like that is completely ridiculous in my mind. And so like, those are some things that we are talking about in Austin, is that because because particularly not only in my role on Reimagine Public Safety, but in my role in oversight, I want to see the lane of law enforcement narrowed. It's a little bit too wide for me because officers are being tasked and expected to do things that, one, they don't need to, and two, they don't have the training. So in my mind, let's just do the basic math, the cost benefit analysis. On average, I think an APD officer is probably making at least close to $100,000 a year. And we think that that would be a good investment for them to do, you know, traffic control or the other things that Elizabeth, like, I don't think you necessarily need, you know, a trained officer to do that. What I think is a better investment is to have trained officers who are doing crime prevention and crime solving and that type of things, because specifically related to protecting and serving, because a lot of the things that we're talking about don't really fall under that umbrella. And I think that we need to get back to narrowing, and that is part of the reimagining. If we can get back to narrowing the lane of law enforcement, those dollars that were allocated for them to do everything, the be all, the end all, could be reallocated to other things that can really help push communities, particularly those that have been disproportionately impacted, forward.
Yeah, I wouldn't add much to that. I think I completely agree. There was this, I can't remember right now, but the growth of the budget for the police department in Chicago's in the 60s has, you know, extrapolated. And it's just, you know, it's a practice of just like keep increasing, right? It's and without like clear establishment of priorities and overview of that, this becomes just, you know, a business as usual review. And when we don't have mechanisms in place for transparency, it's very easy for this increases of an allocation of resources to just keep business as usual. So I agree with Farah, like the review, like, do we need these positions to be there? Probably not, but we just went with the flow and adding resources and positions and services that not necessarily need to be allocated anymore. So let's break it down and think of ways in which they can be absorbed by other departments. Specifically, like I would insist in the public health one, because that's a public safety, public health, stability. That's the number one item that keeps coming back in the conversations with communities.
Can I add to that too? I'm going to just throw out there, it seems to me like there's plenty of opportunities for planners when thinking about physical design, even to help add to their case for any kind of particular physical design or redesign of a space. Or I'm thinking about an intersection or something that might have a dangerous pedestrian crossing or issues with a bike lane or whatever. You know, you can add a public safety element to your case for your design where it's relevant, and not to forget that. And I think something like that feels consistent with the overall sort of reimagining kind of framework that Farah and Paola have shared.
One question for Farah that I'm actually interested in myself is, what will happen in Austin if that bill gets passed at the state that penalizes communities, city communities that change and alter their budgets from the police?
So I think that's what's going to make this new fiscal year that we're going into. Our fiscal year starts on October 1, and we've already started budget conversations. The manager gives his budget just July 9th. And so unlike Illinois, our governor here signs bills immediately. There was a 60-day window for Illinois governors to sign it, and they always seem to kind of sign it at the last minute. So this governor, I forgot his name, probably intentionally, is going to probably sign it right away. And so what that means is there's been different variations of the bill, but it may limit the police funding to what was last year, so the 2020 numbers, or it may go back to like 2018, 2019 numbers, which means that the city would be required to increase funding. And so it's going to make reinvestment, reallocation, all the re's that we've been seeing, restructuring, extremely difficult. I mean, I'm hesitating to say, you know, impossible. But our city council is also very litigious, so I kind of think that they might do it anyway and just be sued, because there's probably an argument over excessive authority by the governor in kind of doing that. So I imagine there's going to be some litigation about that. And it doesn't only affect Austin, even though Dallas and Houston haven't really defunded, reallocated, but they have attempted to, so it impacts them as well, in San Antonio. So I imagine it's going to be litigated, but what I think is unfortunately probably going to happen is that it forces the city to be more conservative in terms of pushing it forward. So how we saw 31 million last year, I was hoping we could get to 50 million this coming year, right? And increase that reinvestment over time. But I think if that bill passes, it's completely unlikely, unfortunately. Abbott, Greg Abbott. Sorry, guys, I was unprofessional. His name is Governor Greg Abbott.
And now I'm going to stay tuned to see what happens. I guess another question that came through is how Austin and folks in Chicago are thinking about changing the scope of laws and redefining crime altogether, and changing the scope of police to ignore the words used were victimless crimes. Do either of you have thoughts on that?
So Austin's kind of done that. And let me tell you, Austin's a really unique place. So for example, the city council made the decision to decriminalize homelessness, right? And so people in the city of Austin didn't like it. So they put on a ballot measure to make it a crime again that overwhelmingly passed. And then the Texas legislature passed a state law, I think that the governor already signed, banning camping and encampments, right? And so it's difficult in Austin because a lot of the decisions that the city council makes, you know, can be overturned by the legislature. Fortunately, with the movement on marijuana, we haven't seen them try to revert back the city's decision not to do arrests for low-level possession of marijuana. They are going forward probably within the next month, within the next 30 days, the police department is putting forward a proposal not to do arrests for low-level any controlled substance, which I think is a great step in the right direction. Again, it's also doing a cost-benefit analysis, right? And so, like, you know, for someone who has an ounce of whatever drug, is it really worth the time that the officer is spending in that? And especially when our criminal justice system is separated from misdemeanor, and it's two completely different systems for misdemeanor and felony. So essentially, both of those DAs, county attorney and the DAs, have said they're not even prosecuting those cases. So it fundamentally is a waste of time for PD to do it anyway, but they just took a little bit longer to come to the party. But now they have decided not to do that. So slowly but surely, but I just want to get across the point that a lot of what Austin has to grapple with, that Chicago probably will never have to grapple with, is decisions being made at a local level and being overturned in the state level. That is always a consideration in Austin.
Yeah, I just wanted to offer a couple of insights there. I mean, there's no, this is interesting because one of the reflections and that we've been having with a couple of other people in conversations was that, you know, they're very fundamental items that could be reimagined, right? For instance, why do we need to figure out a budget on a yearly basis? Very fundamental. Other cities have other timeframes because the allocation of resources, it feels, a year doesn't feel like enough time to figure out all this, the investments that are needed in communities, especially at the pace. So if you think about it, there have been some ideas, again, this is not a practice that is like a novel idea. It happens in other cities that take 2 years to define their budget. So different timeframes that can help us to understand what could be other transformative items in the different departments that could put people first. And all this analysis that Farah is mentioning, like how do we break down these different items from specifically from direct services to communities that are being harmful, specifically coming from the police department? How do we start thinking those in a way that can be, if not supplemented, reallocated or addressed by other city departments? A time frame of a year, it's almost like an impossible task. So rethinking time frames and giving a time to really analyze documentation. It's very difficult to understand the different ways in which the budget is explained, specifically if you start looking at how much goes to service debt or pension funds. If we really want to get into the bolts and nuts of understanding those allocations, we can spend hours and not necessarily understand, as residents, what is the solution? It could be daunting, of course. The other comment was, there was an effort from the city of Chicago to put a survey out. And I don't know if you were aware of that survey. It had a very, very strong participation. The highlight of the survey was we don't want to allocate resources to police department. We want to allocate resources to other things. So that was a very clear statement. What was not there is the accountability system for that collective opinion, right? So it became a survey, it can be just a collection of opinions, but then if there's no accountability systems in place for these types of tools, everything else is wishful thinking. So as much as the city wants to lead with this type of participatory processes, if there's no accountability system behind them, it's very difficult, it's very challenging to think where changes can be made. So yeah, there was a survey, the response was clear, the call was clear around defunding or allocating resources into, not into the police, but other items of the budget. But it wasn't clear, the mayor said it's not possible, but it wasn't clear, then tell us how and what are the steps being taken forward. Is there an idea to put some form of accountability behind that demand that clearly they came from thousands, more than 1,000 residents. So it's just interesting to see how do we embrace, or how do we collectively demand the embracing of accountability frameworks around these tools, because that was a very significant piece of engagement. And I have not heard, maybe you have, I have not heard if there's any efforts, tangible efforts behind those specific desires from residents.
Great, thank you. So our next question is, what should planners be looking for in their own department budgets that could be reallocated or realigned to promote public safety and equity? It's kind of a big question.
No pressure in this conversation. Sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, for sure. What should planners be looking for in their own department budgets that could be reallocated or realigned to promote public safety and equity? So I guess within their own planning departments.
Is this a question? So planners in their like different, I guess, budget departments or any department in the city. I forget, we're Illinois wide. So yeah, I would say, from that standpoint, I think it's important engagement process. Like we need to start funding those because if we don't necessarily have the resources to engage. And I would like to hear from Farah, how's that work in Austin? Is there a budget for actually engagement? And that's something that you don't see often necessarily in city departments, but I would be curious, like how this is intense work, right? How do you assemble? How do you facilitate? How do you outreach? So it has many layers of of labor and energy included. So I would be curious, well, interested in like how, one, this should be an investment. If we're interested in participatory budgeting processes, this should be an investment that comes from the public, number one. Number two, how different departments can allocate resources to this, and how do they collectively, not in silos, because that has been one of the difficulties learning in Chicago, that in many ways because of the scale of the city, but the city departments are very siloed, and that makes really difficult like cross information, cross collaboration. So thinking of ways of almost sharing resources, and thinking of items that can be shared across departments, if there are any, and then mapping this in a way that it's easy to find or understand those relationships among the services. So yeah, I'll be curious, Farah, how's that work in Austin?
So I am not a proponent of taking money from smaller departments. So like, I can just tell you, prior to the reinvestment in my office budget has been around about $1 million since 2002. And so to me, it is counterintuitive to try to reallocate funds from an office like mine towards a greater purpose, because we serve such a public purpose. And so if anything, I think it would be better to reinvest in planners' budget because of the direct relation to their work and its improvement in kind of figuring out better community resources. So like, I think that it's always better to look at the departments that are absorbing much of the city or the municipality's budget, because that is where you're going to have more room to reimagine, reallocate, and figure things out. There's less room, especially when you look at kind of, this is also like where the politics and the nuance and the thread of budgets, why there's so much power in that. Prior to the reinvestment into my office, that $1 million, 80% of that is salaries. So unless I'm willing to let go of some people to find some room to reallocate those, that was the only way I'm going to have. And so essentially, this web includes people, and people who are protected by entities who are powerful, particularly in Chicago. And so the budget, the larger budget discussion that Joe asked us that question, it's really complex. And so, you know, I would never offer up planner's budget on the table. I would want to look at CTA and, you know, why couldn't, you know, a few $1 million be reinvested from the CTA budget, right, into the planners, right, to help better maybe transportation resources, right? I don't know, I mean, Chicago has a great transportation system, Austin not so much, but I'm just using that as an example of really kind of thinking in a different way. And they're also going to say, well, it's a different budget, but let me tell you, when it comes to government, there's a will, there's a way. And so even though it might not be under the same pie, the pies are already connected anyway, right? And so there is a way to do that, but you know, obviously change is very hard for people. And I think the way to get around it is showing the benefit to the community. But one of the things I think that is just so great with Paula's group is I think that the more the community gets informed about the budget, because like our community here, like really spent time on it. And I will be in a meeting with a community member and they will ask me, well, why is PD spending, you know, 16.2 million on their lake patrol? Like that makes no sense. And I'll be like, are you kidding me? You know what I mean? And so that's kind of the culture here in Austin in terms of our community being really informed about it. So it's not, so when let me just tell you this quick story. When the city manager did his budget address last year, and this is post George Floyd and post the push, the community acted like went off because the reduction in what his proposed budget was only a reduction of $12 million. So it's very difficult to kind of pull the wool over the community's eyes here, and they went insane. They were like, are you kidding me? And so I think that that's kind of different in Chicago, where the efforts to educate the community and be more involved, because to a certain extent, kind of the government takes advantage of the lack of awareness the community has about the budget process because it is so complex. And so that's where you kind of see more of the special interest in the maintenance of the status quo continuing to happen budget after budget.
Yeah, I guess I kind of want to put Paula on the spot a little. I know when we were prepping, you talked a lot about things you learned about the budget process and like how much control like we actually have in the budget and how much is allocated to different departments. Would you mind talking about that a little bit?
Sure. Well, many things that I've learned since last year. It is great because I can also, have many conversations with a lot of Chicagoans about it in a way that doesn't feel overwhelming. I think a lot of that has been a journey, right? How as planners, our job is also to make information that is complex and layered and jargony accessible to residents. And so that item, that piece of information around, well, we actually control very little of that money. When I say we is when I'm talking about city council, because those are elected officials and those are our elected officials who we have access to, or we should be establishing relationships with them. And, discovering that, CPS has a budget of, sorry, I need to look at my numbers here. That CPS has almost a budget of proposed 7.1 billion, right? If you remember the video, the total number was $12.6 billion for the city budget. Chicago Public Schools is a different bucket and it's 7.1 billion. So that's still a lot of money. It just means that it's a different bucket. They're called sister agencies. So sister agencies include Chicago Public Schools, Chicago Transit Authority, Chicago Housing Authority, Chicago Park District, and City Colleges of Chicago, that they have their own governance, right? We have no say in whatsoever on how those dollars are allocated and spent. So just explaining, like, that was honestly like a first part of the conversation with a lot of our residents, like understanding what do we actually have decision-making process power, if any. So, and then from those 12.6 billion that the city every year allocates or gets to distribute or allocate in different departments, actually 5.9 billion go to general financing requirements. So that includes employment benefits, pension funds, and a big bucket of that is long-term debt service. So we end up, if we start, just making the math of that, we end up with a very, very reduced amount of dollars. The other good and interesting thing that was important to learn last year was a lot of federal resources were coming and also distributed through our city council, like CARES Money Act, that also came through that. This year's ARPA, all the American Recovery Money strategy. So there's an infusion of important amount of resources this year that they're going to be passed through city council. So we're not only keeping an eye on, the numbers that I just described really briefly, really broadly, but there's extra amount of dollars that we need to be alert on how they're going to be distributed, especially if we really believe in a budget that can be equitable. How does those resources get allocated intentionally where the most impacted communities are? So learning, these items and learning how to speak about them in a conversation that can be productive and a conversation that empowers residents to have a conversation with their older people.
Thank you. So we only have a few more minutes left, and there's a lot of questions. But before we head out for closing remarks, I want to see if Joe, if you had any questions or comments you wanted to add before we end the panel.
No, one thing I would add is just to reinforce or lift up Paula's comment about the importance of resources for community engagement, for resident engagement. I think it's often an overlooked part of costs associated with any government's operation, but it's tremendously important. And good engagement takes time and costs money. And I think Paula gave an example of maybe not so great engagement, right? Where somebody did a survey and it wasn't clear whether all the questions were addressed, and then there was no follow-up, right? And that's an example of what people become accustomed to, right? When you don't have enough resources, it sounds like that was probably a decision made. I would bet resources were a key part of why they took that approach, right? When there's much, much better ways to get folks' voices involved. And so you hear that from the example of both panelists' work, really, really thoughtful engagement, given the time to educate people so that they really understand what they're expressing their viewpoints on. And so that'll be my one sort of big advocacy plug or push related to the panel.
Thank you, Joe. And thank you to all panelists. I wanted to thank you all for your time and your expertise. We didn't get to all the questions, but if you want to reach out to me, I'll put my email down, and you can email me in your questions. I can reach out to the panel directly. And then I also wanted to make sure that everyone knows that tomorrow you receive an email with a recording of this panel. And they will also please fill out the post-webinar survey. And if you enjoy this panel and want to get more involved with DEI, please email me as well. I will put my email in the chat right now. And we could hopefully put on more events like this, and continue to promote diversity in our profession, as well as keep having these conversations. And another quick plug. APA Illinois is accepting nominations for our 2021 awards program. Please please help us honor our credible work in the community by nominating people and projects. Nominations are due by June 18th. And with that, I think we're going to finish a little bit early. Does anyone have anything else to add before we say goodbye to everyone?
Just want to say thank you for organizing this. It was really great to learn about Austin's perspective. Farah, I might just reach out to you because we keep doing research, and this is such a great timing to learn about what you're doing. I've been copying all the resources that you've been sharing. I appreciate the team, the APA Illinois team, for putting us together. And Joe, it's been a pleasure being here with you.
Likewise, thanks, Paula. Thanks, Farah.
And thanks everyone for your questions. You made it a great discussion.
Yeah, like I said, if we didn't get to your questions, if you want to learn more from a panelist, reach out to me at my email, and I'll put you in contact with the panelist.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody. This is really great.
Thank you. Have a good night, guys.
Cheers of Chicago. You guys made me miss Chicago a little bit.
Yeah, I miss Austin myself.
All right.
Yeah, have a good night, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.